DiplomacyLight
Podcast. Hello, and welcome to the 6th episode of the DiplomacyLight podcast. In this episode, I talk with Paul Scharre about his new book, Four Battlegrounds, Power in the Age of Artificial Intelligence. The four battlegrounds Paul talks about are data, compute, human talent, and the institutions necessary to nurture those three. The book reminded me of two seminal works of the 20th century, Paul Kennedy's Rise and Fall of the Great Powers and Yergin Stanislav's Commanding Heights. This inspired me to call this episode Commanding Heights in the Century of Artificial Intelligence. Hi, Paul, and thanks for coming to the DiplomacyLight podcast. And first of all, congratulations on your new book. The previous book, Army of None, was a real success and really established a high standard for quality and a lot of information in it. Your most recent addition to the literature is called Four Battlegrounds, Power in the Age of Artificial Intelligence. I read it and really enjoyed it. By your own description, you describe that the AI can have a lot of constructive uses, but your book is, and I quote, about the darker side of AI. Nice. Now, there's, I think for a lot of people, darker side of AI right away, there's images of Skynet, of Terminator, of these kinds of things. But you describe a different kind of, the frame, first of all, is the international system, the power within it. And to be honest, the two kind of books and frames that came to mind as I was reading them, one was Paul Kennedy, who you mentioned in your book in the beginning, The Rise and Fall of Great Powers. And he describes the importance of the two wings of a bird, of the economy as well as the military, that a great power cannot focus on just one or the other, because in the end it will lose because of that kind of focus. The other is Commanding Heights, in which Yergin and Stanislav, it was a book, they put together a documentary as well. They describe a battle of ideas of the 20th century. Now, this seems to be kind of who gets the commanding heights. Your book is about who gets the commanding heights of the 21st century, about power in the age of AI. Can you tell us more about it?
Yeah, well, thank you. Well, first of all, thank you for having me on the podcast. And thank you for the very kind words. I'm very excited to get the book out there. Glad you enjoyed it and excited to share it with readers. As you talked about, the book explores how artificial intelligence is changing global power and what are some of the risks that come with it. And it's not the risk that science fiction has warned us about AI turning on us. The book really explores the risks about what people might do with artificial intelligence and what people are already doing, whether it's the techno-authoritarian surveillance state that China is building and exporting abroad, or the risks of military AI in ways that they might cause harm or cause accidents or cause wars to spiral out of control. One of the things that the book explores is, as we think about artificial intelligence like another industrial revolution, we saw the industrial revolution change global power in profound ways. And I'm glad you brought up Paul Kennedy's book, because it was certainly an inspiration. And I went back and reread The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers to try to better understand how did the Industrial Revolution change not just warfare, but also initially economic productivity that then countries are able to translate into military power, as they took economic power or military potential power and then translated that into military power by things like repurposing factories for then churning out tanks and airplanes and ships. And one of the things that really struck me was that not only did we see countries rise and fall on the global stage during the Industrial Revolution by how rapidly they industrialized, as we saw, for example, Germany and Great Britain race ahead in terms of economic power in the 19th century, and Russia fall behind because they were slow in industrializing. We also saw the key metrics of power change. So things like coal and steel production became key inputs of national power. Oil became a geostrategic resource that countries were willing to fight wars over. And so, it's certainly commonplace to say things today like data is the new oil. And like any metaphor, there are, things about that are helpful or that are maybe not helpful. But this question of what are the key inputs to national power, like oil and coal and steel production and manufacturing capacity in an age of AI, is something that motivated me writing the book. And certainly the book is framed around this question. And I came to the conclusion that there are four key battlegrounds in the age of artificial intelligence. Whoever leads in those battlegrounds will, seize the commanding heights, if you will, on AI power. And they are data. So data is certainly very important, whether it's oil or not. Data is a critical input to artificial intelligence. Computing hardware, or sometimes called compute, the chips that are used to train machine learning algorithms on data. The human talent that's used behind all these AI systems, and the institutions that countries are using to adopt AI, integrated within their societies or within their militaries. And whoever leads in these four areas of data, computing hardware, talent, and institutions will be able to lead in this century of artificial intelligence.
Now, some may lead in one or two or three, and there, especially in a multipolar world, it's going to be different. Alliances will matter. Let's start one by one, though. We got accustomed, first of all, to this hype of data is the new oil. You just mentioned it. I think we're at the tail end of that hype, because the comparison, as you write in the book, is sometimes okay, but sometimes not a proper one. Data is and it is not a finite resource as oil, like one of the several reasons. Tell us about data and how that will shape power.
Right. So data is really an essential input to machine learning systems, because machine learning systems are trained on data. So something like ChatGPT, for example, the chatbot that is taking the world by storm, is trained on massive amounts of text, and a big chunk of the text on the internet. And many of these machine learning systems use hundreds of gigabytes of data. So where the analogy of oil is helpful is to think about data as just like oil needs to be collected and refined and then becomes the fuel for internal combustion engines. Data needs to be pooled, collected, and refined, and then becomes the fuel, if you want to use that term, that powers machine learning systems, and that they're trained on data. Now, one of the interesting aspects of the geopolitical competition from the data standpoint is there's a widespread perception that China has a major advantage in data for two key reasons. One, China has a very large population and therefore a large internet user base. So there's simply more people to draw data from, and large data sets are more valuable. So there is advantages in diversity of data and the type of data, but there is simply an advantage alone in scale in training more capable machine learning systems. And then the second reason why China supposedly has a data advantage is because of the different data governance regimes inside China. And certainly the Chinese Communist Party has the ability to collect data on its citizens, and it is doing so in ways that many other countries around the world and democracies can't or are not doing that, whether it's in the US or Europe or other nations. And on the surface, it seems like China has an advantage here. So roughly half of the world's 1 billion surveillance cameras are in China. They're increasingly using facial recognition, gait recognition to identify people based on how they walk. China is combining this with data on people's spending habits, geolocation data on their travel, on who they're connected with, to monitor and track Chinese citizens. And in some discrete areas, like facial recognition, for example, I think it's quite clear that actually Chinese companies will have a big leg up. In the United States, by comparison, there has been a grassroots movement against the use of facial recognition for law enforcement. And so we've seen the development of a patchwork series of regulations and bans on law enforcement using facial recognition at the state and local level. And the effect has been that the big tech companies, IBM, Amazon, Microsoft, have all gotten out of the game in the US for facial recognition for law enforcement. And so companies like SenseTime in China are likely to have a big leg up on maturing their facial recognition systems because they have greater government spending. They have the ability to collect data by using these systems out in the real world. And they're going to get more feedback on the performance of their algorithms by deploying them out in the real world and getting a chance to use these. Now, where the analogy breaks down about data and the new oil is data is not a fungible resource. So more data on Chinese faces isn't going to help you train a better AI fighter pilot because the data can't be used in that way. In fact, the data often is useful in such a narrow fashion that data on Chinese faces may not help you on non-Chinese faces. We've seen with facial recognition algorithms, for example, that they don't necessarily translate well across from men to women or across different races and ethnicities. And so this is a real limitation of data. And when you look closer, when you sort of look below the surface on the different data governance regimes in China, the US, and in Europe, you'll see that within China, there's this sort of a bifurcation of data governance within China. That is to say that the state has effectively no limitations on what it can do. The law in China exists to be a vehicle for the Chinese Communist Party's power. It's not there to constrain the government the way that it does exist in democratic nations. But there are restrictions on Chinese companies. And in fact, the Chinese Communist Party has been cracking down quite considerably on Chinese tech companies, reeling them in as independent power bases. And there's been quite a bit of innovation in government regulations surrounding consumer data privacy inside China. There have been a number of scandals about user privacy, and the government's been putting more regulations in place. So the type of advantages the government has don't necessarily translate over to private companies all the time inside China. The other thing that's really important is that what really matters from a tech company standpoint is actually not the national user base of the country that they're headquartered in, but the user base of that company. And US tech companies have global reach. So platforms like Facebook and YouTube are not constrained by the size of the US population. They have each over 2 billion users globally, which is much bigger than, for example, WeChat's 1.2 billion users. And other than TikTok, Chinese companies have actually really struggled to break out of China and succeed in the global marketplace. Now, that may change, but at least for now, US tech companies have a big advantage in terms of having larger and diversified user bases because they're actually not constrained by the size of the US population. So, at the end of the day, data is a resource that the US and China and Europe all have access to. And what's going to matter more than simply sort of sheer number of people within national population is going to be, what do companies and governments do with data? How do they refine the data? How do they employ it effectively? When I talked with people in the US military about their efforts to integrate AI, one of the things that came up all the time was the barriers they're running into in getting access to the data. They didn't have the ability to get the right permissions. They didn't have the ability to collect the data. It wasn't in the right format. They couldn't connect to computer networks to transfer the data. And sometimes I'll hear, they said it took them 6 or 9 months to get access to the data. And then once they had access to it, 2 weeks to train the algorithm. And so the winner of the data contest is likely to be whoever's able to put in place institutions that are able to get access to this data, clean it up, refine it, and then use it in a useful fashion for various AI applications.
Interesting that some of the things that as we're talking, they are changing in the sense. Just today, I was checking what are the top apps on the iPhone. 2 of the 3 were Chinese. So I mean, even this is now changing. So, but let's start to compute, because you have a very nice analogy there where you say that if China is the Saudi Arabia of data, and that if that has been overused, Taiwan is certainly the Saudi Arabia, if we might say, in terms of compute, in terms of the processors. TSMC is really a huge company with a global potential on monopoly, really. Dutch ASML in supplying extreme ultraviolet lithography tools that are really useful and necessary to create the hardware. So when we turn to compute, this seems to be at the moment a real advantage that if we're comparing US and China or the West has. Is that the case?
Absolutely. Data is a relatively level playing field. The US and other allied nations, particularly Japan, the Netherlands, South Korea, and Taiwan, have a huge leg up on the hardware competition. And that's because hardware is concentrated through these key choke points in the geopolitical supply chain. And so well, it's just not true that China is the Saudi Arabia of data for all the reasons that I walked through. It isn't a stretch to say that Taiwan is the Saudi Arabia of compute. Over 90% of the world's most advanced semiconductors are made in Taiwan. And, certainly the geopolitical pressure surrounding Taiwan, the fact that 100 miles off the coast of China, and they have made quite clear that their intention is to absorb Taiwan by force if necessary, that puts Taiwan in a unique position geopolitically in terms of the role that it plays in this absolutely critical resource for machine learning and for the AI revolution. And so, but it's not just Taiwan, right? There are other countries. You mentioned the Dutch firm ASML. ASML, of course, has a monopoly on extreme ultraviolet lithography, the equipment that's needed to make the most advanced chips. Japan also plays a really critical role, particularly in the chemicals that are used for advanced chip making. South Korea also a major producer of leading chips. And so, it's really interesting because when you look at the geopolitical competition over hardware, there are some surprising countries that come to the fore in terms of having really outsized political influence. And we've already seen the competition under hardware is underway with the Biden administration's export controls on manufacturing equipment and AI chips to China that came out in October of 2022. Some recent news in the last few weeks that Japan and the Netherlands are going to join those US export controls. It's a little bit fuzzy publicly exactly where Japan and the Netherlands are going to come out on this. I'll be really interested to see as more details come out exactly what their controls look like, because what exactly their controls include is going to have a huge effect on China's ability to indigenize semiconductor manufacturing. It's an area where China's really struggled over the last several decades. They've invested billions. They don't have a whole lot to show for it, unlike in other areas where they've been able to climb up the value chain and improve their capabilities significantly in things like 5G wireless networks, for example, with Huawei's role there before the US used, again, chips as a key point of leverage to harm Huawei's competitiveness in 5G. These export controls stay in place. China's really going to be crippled in its ability to indigenize some of these manufacturing capabilities. And right now, China's heavily vulnerable to this hardware gap. China imports over $400 billion annually in chips. They are very keenly aware of this vulnerability. China's working very hard to try to wean themselves off of foreign chips. And something that Xi Jinping has talked about these vulnerabilities that China has to foreign technology, these dependencies being a major vulnerability for the country. And we're seeing that play out with these new export controls. The fact that Chinese dependency here is a point of leverage that other countries have in terms of controlling China's access to things like cutting edge AI technology.
You use an interesting metaphor in describing the U.S. policy, Trump's specifically on Huawei when it came on 5G, as a drunkard starting a fight in a bar but doesn't really know how to finish it. And it seems that there's a lot of truth to that for several reasons. I think that one of the reasons is exactly what you're describing right now in terms of do the export controls work? I mean, at the end of the day, if the incentive, you might have a short-term gain, but in the long term, you might incentivize higher innovation exactly on it. And then perhaps even a bigger, I would say, danger is that the U.S. has been the champion of open international trade, of no boundaries, no controls of these kinds. And all of a sudden, we're seeing a lot of export controls, a lot of boundaries going into the international trade system, which will affect the whole world, no?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that the U.S., it's a colorful metaphor, but I think it's not wrong. The U.S. stumbled its way into this global chip war without much forethought. And it started because the U.S. was concerned about Huawei's dominance in global 5G wireless networks, I think for valid reasons. And in an effort to try to kneecap Huawei's competitiveness globally and stop the integration of Chinese technology and control over very critical telecommunications networks, including in key partner and allied countries. Ultimately, the administration went after the chips that Huawei had access to. Using an export control tool called the Foreign Direct Product Rule, the US was able to basically stop the export of chips that were designed in China, manufactured in Taiwan, and then destined back for China. And the US was able to do this because the manufacturing inside Taiwan depends on US technology. And so the US was able to say, initially the US said you can't use any US technology in these chips that go to Huawei, and they didn't depend on US technology. So the US had, I think, a fairly weak hand to play here. And ultimately what the US ended up saying was, okay, but you can't use any US technology to manufacture chips destined for Huawei. And that did it. It was really effective. But there is this problem of, with any export controls, the more that you use them, the more that you incentivize various actors, both countries and the private sector, to try to find ways around these export controls. And that is some of my concern that I talk about in the book. I've written about it in other places, like in foreign policy, that the export controls on the chips themselves that the US has put into place might create some of these incentives. That this demand that exists inside China for leading edge chips is there. It's likely going to grow over time. And by restricting access to the chips themselves, the US is basically creating a market incentive globally for a completely US independent supply chain for chips. And that I see as a real problem. And so what the Biden administration did in October was they basically went further beyond this restriction to Huawei. And there are now restrictions nationwide in China to anyone on advanced graphics processing units, GPUs, the kind that are used in cutting edge machine learning applications. And these export controls the US has put in place, they are unilateral and extraterritorial, or what my colleague Emily Kilcrease has called the double sin of export controls. And I think on the surface, one of my concerns is that on the surface, I think in Washington, there's been just tremendous exuberance over these export controls. Oh, look what we did. We cut off chips to China. I think there's a perception in Washington that the ability of US companies to be in these key choke points in the supply chain gives Washington this kind of leverage over China, and look at how powerful we are. I think it's a sign of weakness that the US controls are unilateral and extraterritorial. They're extraterritorial because the manufacturing doesn't happen in the US anymore. And the fact that they're unilateral is even more troubling because it means we haven't been successful in getting our allies on. And at the end of the day, the US is not a unipolar technology power. We're going to have to work with allies, including in hardware, these really critical countries of Japan, the Netherlands, Taiwan, and South Korea, to get them on board. Or the US just doesn't have the dominance in the semiconductor marketplace to go it alone. And if the US is going to compete in this space, we're going to have to work closely with allies and convince them about US concerns.
The third battleground that you mentioned is talent. And in this sense, if we're speaking about much more hard power in these, and even trade policy sometimes can be harder than what Joseph Nye and others, have termed as soft power. And this is where talent is. Do you attract the brightest? Do you attract the best to your universities? And here, if I may, and coming back to this initial frame that I propose of commanding heights, the 20th century was a battle of ideas, and in that there was a battle of two main ideas. Here it was capitalism and communism, but really also a battle between the role of government in the economy, specifically in any country. It went through several stages. Perhaps in the early 20th century, less government, then mid 20th century, more government, then again 70s onwards, 80s, less government. It seemed like it won, that this kind of idea. But right now we're talking about, again, more government, right? Because there is another more government that is doing this and doing it more efficiently. So, can you just tell us about the talent aspect, the talent battleground, but also this part of attracting talent and retaining it?
Absolutely. So if the first two battlegrounds, data and computing hardware, are about the technical inputs to building AI systems, the next two, talent and institutions, are about the human inputs. And human talent is really critical for actually harnessing this technology. Out in the AI space, there is an incredible competition for top tier AI talent. So, AI researchers coming out of PhD programs at major universities are getting like, professional sports level salaries, like NFL level salaries. And there's a fierce competition for global talent. And what's interesting is when you look at the global talent flows, similar to things like hardware, there's a lot of globalization and interconnection, but people can move. And that is one of the critical differences when we're looking at the competition over talent. So more of the top AI researchers in the world come from China than any other country. But they don't stay in China. They come to the United States. They come to the United States to study, and then they stay in the United States after graduation. So in surveys, the US is the top destination for AI scientists from around the world. And when you look at the talent flows of Chinese researchers, so over half of China's top undergraduates studying AI come to the US for their graduate work. And then of those Chinese-born researchers doing their PhD in the United States, 90% of them stay in the US after graduating from their PhD, because there's better, certainly personal freedoms here in the United States, but also better opportunities for entrepreneurship and founding a company and growing and getting access to capital. And so that's a major magnet for global talent. And one of the really challenging things from a US policy standpoint is right now, in fact, the US government is harming itself in one of its biggest advantages that the US has over China. And so we're creating all of these barriers to top AI scientists coming to the US and staying in the US, whether it's things like caps on H-1B visas or green cards. And that's a real challenge going forward. It's caught up in US domestic policy over immigration and the southern border in the United States. But it's something that the US government's going to have to figure out, because the US has an asymmetric advantage over China in this talent competition, but only if it actually uses some of that potential.
In both talent and in institutions, the institutions that are there, again, depend on what's, I would call it, the operating system, right? Like, yes. The operating system at the moment is capitalism, the global one. And it seems, the battles of the 20th century are behind. But perhaps that's just a recession away, a depression away in a major economy where things change. And all of a sudden, there is a country, a big power, China specifically, that is socialist, well, communist. I don't know to what degree that's still present as an ideology inside. I think that there's a lot of capitalist movements within it. But the idea is there. Is there a danger that all of a sudden this battle of ideas resurfaces of capitalism against communism?
Yeah, well, I'm certainly not sure that it's there's this question of how would you characterize the Chinese political economy, right? And what terms you'd want to use. But I certainly think that there is a contest that's underway globally for thinking about models of governance, both from an economic growth standpoint and political and social governance. And a lot of countries globally are looking at China as a model. And China has been able to thread the needle on what folks call the dictator's dilemma. This idea that prior to China, you could look at countries' political situation and how liberal they were from a political standpoint and economic growth, and say that at a certain point, countries basically have one of two paths that they can go down. Either they can begin to liberalize their economy, and we'll see down the road that the free flow of information and people in things like the market also leads to greater political freedoms over time. And, politicalization follows economic liberalization. That was certainly the hope with the United States in the 90s in terms of greater engagement with China, that this would happen over time. Or for many countries, the path was, okay, you can close yourself off, you can maintain tight control, but then you end up down the path of something like North Korea. And China's been able to manage those and have really unprecedented economic growth over the last several years in human history. Has done, has lifted millions out of poverty, dramatically improved the standard of living for Chinese citizens, while maintaining ironclad control in terms of the political control the Chinese Communist Party has over the Chinese people. And we haven't seen that. There have been maybe pressures inside China, but the Chinese Communist Party has been able to manage those pressures through building up a really intensive apparatus of already to date censorship, both within the Chinese information ecosystem and then walling that off from outside information and propaganda internally, but increasingly more AI-enabled forms of oppression. And that's one of the things the book talks about that's really deeply troubling, is this new Chinese-style model of techno-authoritarianism that we're seeing pioneered internally within China, certainly an extreme version in Xinjiang, where there's really intense control in terms of China's repression over the Uyghurs there, but also nationwide across China with things like surveillance cameras, but also China's social credit system, monitoring Chinese persons' behavior. And we're seeing the export of that globally. Over 80 countries purchasing and getting access to Chinese surveillance technology. And even more troubling, I would argue, Chinese style norms and laws that are being exported from China. And so the book talks about over 30 countries that have gotten briefings and trainings by China on things like cybersecurity law and information environment, as China is looking to export its social software that underpins this kind of model of AI-enabled repression that's deeply troubling globally. And I think it's really important that democracies work together to push back against this use of artificial intelligence.
You mentioned one aspect, one, if not a battleground, certainly a point of tension of standards. And usually, yes, when one thinks of standards, one thinks of, well, they're there to reduce complexity, to standardize, to find a way that solves problems in a manner that all can agree. But they're actually a way of an aspect of geopolitical tensions as well, isn't it? And all of a sudden, that is becoming an issue in bodies like the International Standardization Organization, International Telecommunications Union, and others. Is it possible to turn that perhaps into a platform for understanding, a platform for communication, a platform for really developing standards that are, for AI specifically, that can be useful instead of points of tension?
Well, I think we have to. I think we have to find ways to preserve the integrity of those standard-setting bodies and also ensure that the technical standards that are being set aren't ones that undermine democratic values. And so standards are, for the wonky AI policy folks that follow this issue, they're probably well aware of the really importance of technical standards in this global competition over AI governance. But it's maybe not one that grabs a lot of news headlines or necessarily gets a lot of attention. But it's really important because there are these technocratic standard-setting bodies. And we've seen China become much more active in them, which itself would be a good thing if the Chinese Communist Party was engaging, if the Chinese government were engaging in a way that wasn't looking to distort these standard-setting bodies. And we're seeing that happen in two key ways. So one of these is the Chinese government putting their thumb on the scales to simply benefit Chinese companies from a global competitiveness standpoint. And we've certainly seen that in standards competitions over 5G wireless networks, where the government gets all of the Chinese companies together, gets everyone on the same page, brings more heft to that conversation. And that's just yet another example where we see China engaging in economic competition in a way where there's this blend of economic competitiveness and national security that's certainly not consistent with the rules of free and fair competition and market access globally. And very much in line with what we see China doing on things like intellectual property theft and espionage, for example. But the other one is that these technical standards are not apolitical. And I think a really essential insight when we're looking at governance of AI or data or surveillance technology or any of these other things, social media platforms, is that any kind of technology, once it's instantiated into an artifact, there is some element of political values that are inherent in that artifact it's creating. Something like social media is an example of this, of, you have something like Twitter, where it enables anyone to basically create an account very easily, go on the platform, broadcast their message. There's an inherent implicit value behind that giving everyone a megaphone is a good thing. We want to democratize the ability for people to access information and then to share their voice. And of course, there are, pluses and minuses with that. It turns out that it's not quite as simple as maybe people might have hoped a decade ago when there was a big excitement about this democratization of information. But that's true in any of these things. And so it's things like, the way that facial recognition standards are instantiated. Do those technical standards in some settings, for example, this has come up, include things like people's race and ethnicity. Well, that can be then used for discrimination, which in fact we see China doing within China, internally building things like Uyghur detection systems to try to identify someone's ethnicity, whether or not they're a Uyghur, based on facial recognition. And so that's some of the areas where, there are some really troubling applications of these technologies, and we want to ensure that we maintain the integrity of these technical standard setting bodies and ensure they're not being used in a way that furthers repression and undermines human freedom around the world.
You quote Maya Wong of Human Rights Watch in saying something that may be in the minds of many. This is what she says, quote, "The world is essentially being put forward two fairly bad proposals." She speaks of tech governance, but this could be said for much wider global governance aspects. One is the US surveillance capitalism model, driven by big companies and essentially is about us all being herded into particular directions to spend money. The other is the Chinese government model of mass surveillance. Neither of those are preferable. Must it be one or the other? Is there something in between?
Well, I think we have to find an alternative model. And that is one of the key themes in the book, is what is the alternative model to this Chinese-style AI-enabled repression that we're seeing beginning to proliferate globally. And as Maya Wong points out, and I think she's like, I thought it was a great and very valuable insight. Right now, there isn't a good competing model that democracies are bringing for this is a way to use this technology, whether it's social media, data collection, AI, surveillance tech, that preserves democratic values and individual freedom. And the competing model right now is surveillance capitalism. This basically has all sorts of problems. And of course, the US has a very laissez-faire approach to tech governance, whereas Europe has been leaning quite a bit into technology governance with GDPR and various types of AI governance. The US has been very slow to respond here. Now, I do think that in the long run, open societies had a tremendous advantage here, specifically because the governance process within open societies is one that brings together a whole variety of different voices. So you do see in the US in debates over things like facial recognition, this complex interplay of different actors, this messy give and take between state, local, and federal authorities, private tech companies, members of civil society, grassroots movements of concerned citizens, debating how are we going to use this. It's just that this process takes more time. And sometimes that can be frustrating, right? We want an answer right now. Within China, when the Chinese Communist Party says, this is how we're going to govern the technology, bam, they just do it, right? They dictate by fiat. And we've actually seen them move forward quite a bit with different forms of governance, for example, on things like synthetic media online and on deep fakes of various types of fashions, where it's much more of the Wild West here in the United States on these things. But that process of getting stakeholders together, having a diverse array of interests is really essential to getting the best outcome in the long run. But I do think there's an urgency within democratic societies for us to accelerate that process of coming to what are the conclusions, how are we going to regulate this technology, how are we going to govern it, so that we can compete in this global contest about technology governance.
There's one point in the book where I laughed out loud. Really, it was this example of they use of where there was an AI system that is put to recognize 8 Marines and see as they're approaching them, and they use different techniques to try to approach the system and not be noticed. One is they go into a cardboard and they move in the cardboard. The other is a Marine does somersaults for 300 meters or something like that. Yeah. A third dresses up as a fir tree. And this really brings up this, we keep on thinking of all the possibilities of combining AI plus weapons. And usually they're offensive weapons, sometimes defensive, but there's all these aspects of brittleness, right? That really create a lot of dangers about it. I mean, the hype is there, But what about these not so superhuman abilities of AI and their use of with weapons?
Yeah, I love that anecdote. That came from a DARPA project from the U.S. military's Department of Mad Scientists, it's sometimes called in DARPA, doing cutting edge research on a whole variety of different technologies. And it does illustrate this brittleness of AI systems, that it could be so easily defeated by clever people doing very simple things that would never work against a human, right? So a human sentry would see this cardboard box scooting up and be like, yeah, there's a person under that box. Doesn't require a lot of puzzling it out, but totally defeated the AI because it wasn't trained to do that. And we see this come up time and again with AI systems. Their worldview is limited by their training data. And so if they encounter something that's not captured in the training data, they can fail often quite dramatically. And that's a big limitation in a whole variety of applications, but it's a really big problem for military AI systems, where they're going to be operating in an environment that you can't control and in an inherently adversarial context, where other people are trying to manipulate and defeat these AI systems. And I think it's a real point of caution for militaries as they're thinking about adopting these systems. We talk a lot about legal and ethical concerns about autonomous weapons, for example, and increasingly about military AI. Those are absolutely important. Those are great conversations we need to be having. Those are important concerns. But they're also practical ones of, is this going to work? Is it going to be manipulated by the enemy? And how do we do sufficient testing up front to mitigate some of these concerns, to make sure that AI systems are more reliable, they're more robust? And then how do we put in safeguards for when the inevitable thing happens that we couldn't predict? Because knowing that example, you could go back and say, okay, we're going to train AI on cardboard boxes moving around and let it know, like, so cardboard box moving, that's a problem. Or people somersaulting or crawling or doing cartwheels or walking on their hands, or people dressed up like trees in the one example, and say, oh, the tree's moving, that's a problem. You need to give it a closer look. Trees are not supposed to move. But that's only a few examples, right? So the space of creative things that humans can do is very vast. It's bigger than we're going to be able to come up with, a list, sketching it out on a whiteboard. It's bigger than what militaries are going to be able to do in testing or even in simulations. And so keeping humans involved once these systems are deployed is really essential. And I think, to me, that's one of the big takeaways is we're moving forward with this technology. There are a lot of risks. We can see this already with things like AI chatbots. Google puts out this chatbot, racing to compete with Microsoft, following up on ChatGPT, and it makes a mistake. Google loses $100 billion in company valuation as a response. That's just a chatbot. Certainly, the consequences of a military AI system failing could be much more severe. And that's something that we want to get ahead of, and making sure that we're being safe as we use these systems.
We're at the end, so perhaps just one more question, and it's really the one that got me the most, I think, in the book. It's your discussion of, can AI change the nature of war? I mean, we've talked about the characteristics of war changing, and that's something, war has been war. Technologies have come in, nuclear has changed, gunpowder has changed it, but it's been war. Even right now, today is the 24th February, exactly a year ago, a major war started on European soil, but it's still a war, right? Like, it's in the way that we've understood wars for thousands of years, like certainly hundreds, certainly in the modern system. Now the possibility is, as you say, like, how would one characterize a swarm gone awry and killing, a big population? Is it just an industrial, as you say, mishap? Is it like, how exactly do we characterize it? And I do want to steer that toward a good possibility, because I think that there is such a possibility. One possibility is war is transformed in a bad way, God forbid. But I think that there is this possibility of going into a common ground where there is competition, there is national security considerations. But looking specifically at China China had, gunpowder, the compass, printing press, hundreds, sometimes many centuries before the West, and they used it differently. They used the technology differently.
Right.
Can we come to such a point where the world kind of agrees? Listen, we have some really, really powerful technologies at the moment. Let's kind of agree to disagree on some things. We will compete economically, but outside of that, let's look at how AI can be used for strategic stability, for instance.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so for those who aren't, sort of like military and defense here, I mean, basically, I commit heresy in the book by raising this idea: could AI change the nature of war itself? And that's like a really loaded topic among military and defense scholars. And that the logic basically is that the way that people talk about this is that the character of warfare, the way that militaries fight, is constantly changing. We see that in the war in Ukraine, that the tactics that are being used are already evolving month to month, week to week. But the nature of war, what war is, the underlying aspects of a violent political struggle among competing groups, of chaos and uncertainty and friction, those aspects are timeless and unchanging. And so what I say that's kind of heretical is, well, is that always going to be the case going forward? Is there something that AI could do that would change the nature of war itself? And so we could see a future war, not in the near term. I don't think this is a near term thing, but maybe decades down the road, where there is something that is like war, but it is different in a very deep and fundamental way that has not happened before. And I don't think that's likely to happen with the introduction of tactical AI systems or even AI at the operational level. So I don't think swarms change the nature of war, just like aircraft didn't change the nature of war. They just changed the way that militaries carried out war. But one can envision a far future where AI is integrated into all aspects of military operations, and AI has made a profound change in war itself and the psychology of war by removing aspects of the human element of war that make warfare what it is today. Some Chinese scholars have hypothesized about a singularity on the battlefield in the future, a point in time where the pace of action on the battlefield eclipses humans' ability to understand. And humans have to effectively turn over the keys to machines in order to stay competitive. And we've seen in other competitive environments, like in gaming, for example, in StarCraft and Dota 2, that when humans play against these AI systems, not only are the AI systems better, they play differently than people. Different tactics, but also different psychology. So one of the things that human players have remarked is how the AI systems constantly pressure them. Not only do they have more precision, more coordination in their actions, things you would expect, that they engage in what you might think of as superhuman levels of aggressiveness. Because humans have to take a break, they have to shift their attention somewhere else. AI doesn't have to do that. We see that in real world wars, there's lulls in action and in combat, because humans need to rest. They need to turn their attention somewhere else. And what happens when AI is so deeply integrated into war changes the psychology of war itself. Because now we have not human combatants using AI, which we'll see in the near term, but over time, AI being effectively a combatant itself, a non-human entity. It's very speculative, but I think there's things that we want to think about, because there are, needless to say, profound risks that would come with some of those transitions. And I'm glad you pointed out, I think it's a positive note to end on, that what matters most is not the technology itself, but how do we use this technology? And we have choices. We saw that when nuclear weapons were invented, states ultimately came to a series of international agreements and norms and structures to try to manage the risks of nuclear weapons. It's still more dangerous than we would like, but it's certainly better than the worst fears that people had predicted in the 1950s and 60s about nuclear proliferation and nuclear war. And how can we anticipate those challenges and put in those safeguards today so that we can manage these future that lays ahead of us as we see AI integrated more and more into our society.
Paul, thank you. Let's all work toward perhaps quieting the voices in all countries that are drumming drums of war, and really try to find drums of peace. The very fact that I'm mentioning this really in the same breath as this book, I don't know if you can see it, Rise and Fall.
Yes.
And I'm mentioning your book in the same breath. I think it gives a lot of compliments to your work. It's really a great book, and congratulations for it.
Well,
And thank you
you.
coming for Diplomacy Light podcast.
Well, thank you so much. That's very kind, and I'm glad you enjoyed it. And thank you for having me on the podcast.
Thanks, Paul. Welcome anytime.